Your Royal Highness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon's session is on redefining best practice. So turning to technology, we've heard some technology this morning, but we've got 3 sessions now on technology. Our first speaker is Mark Dewes. He's a farmer and agronomist, has worked for ADAS, NIABTEG, Agri, as well as for himself. He's on the AHDB recommended list committee for wheat varieties. We heard this morning that he has some guilt over the amount of flights he's taken on his studies and the impact they've had on global climate change, so much so that his wife isn't going to get a decent holiday for many years to come. But without further ado, over to Mark, who's going to talk about UK agronomy, what we can learn from overseas to better curate the use of our pesticides. Mark.
Good afternoon, Your Royal Highness, members of my extended Nuffield family. Thank you for the introduction. I have some thank yous to make first. First to the Nuffield Trust for putting their trust in me. Secondly to the Richard Laws Foundation, without whose financial support this wouldn't have been possible. Thank you, Bobby. And of course to all my new friends, both at home and abroad, who helped and welcomed me and helped to make this experience both a great learning process and a lot of fun. UK arable farmers have become dependent on their agronomists for a number of reasons, including an opaque pesticide market and the compulsion by red tractor assurance schemes to use basis qualified advisors. Although agronomists do many other things, then the job that keeps us in regular work is to manage the complexity of pesticide use. So what should the relationship between agronomist and farmer include? Expertise and guidance, yes, but what about accountability? Both financially and for the long-term stewardship of the products that we use. As a big part of the decision-making process, then we as agronomists can't escape some responsibility for the decline in the effectiveness of pesticides. We perform a vital role, but maybe by introducing new, more accountable ways of working, we can move towards a more sustainable future. And by sustainable, I mean producing crops profitably and with a reasonable level of reliance on pesticides. So with that goal in mind, I set off in pursuit of improvements that I could introduce and recommend to UK agronomy. First to South America, and a model which seems to work. I'd like to introduce you to Danilo. Danilo makes all of the agronomic decisions on the 7,000 hectares of arable land that he manages for Sape Agro in western Brazil. Payment by results is a strong part of the South American culture, and Danilo's pay is dictated by the productivity of the crops he grows. And one way that's measured is by the seed spacing that we can see him checking here. So later in the season, then drone imagery will be used to assess the evenness of the soya crop, and that'll be one of the parameters on which his pay is dictated. And this incentivized approach helps to achieve top quartile results in crop production. And by carefully setting those parameters, then Danilo can use all of the tools at his disposal to maximize both his own pay and the productivity of the crops he grows. Now, this is a concept I'd like to see in the UK. The accountability of being judged by the productivity we can drive using not just pesticides, but all of the available tools should be part of the pathway to a more sustainable future. You might ask, where will I find an agronomist who's prepared to be judged and paid according to their results? Well, look no further. I've been busy developing this model for the UK, and clearly it won't be for everybody, but for those farmers who want to subcontract their decision-making, then it should provide a mechanism for aligning the objectives of both agronomist and farmer. And although I'm pushing this concept, then it won't be until farmers use their power as customers to demand this sort of relationship that both trade and independent agronomists will start to give a truly accountable service. Another cultural difference between South American farmers and those in the UK is their willingness to meet with open books in groups to find solutions to their problems from their own experience. This process is best demonstrated by the Korea movement, which is very strong in Argentina and Uruguay. Francisco and his friends meet on each other's farms near Montevideo, and by sharing their detailed costings and rotationally hosting groups on their own farms, they can act as consultants to each other's businesses. And that helps to achieve the sort of performance needed to survive in an unsubsidized world market. There are moves within the UK to adopt this kind of group working model. Projects like AHDB Crop Bench, the Yield Enhancement Network. Now, I think these should be encouraged and supported. CREA groups are self-funded, but if we're to use levy fund money to support this kind of activity, then it should be used to develop the facilitators of these groups rather than creating a national data monster that we can't feed. We want them to work at a local level to solve their own problems, and the experience that exists in CREA and other organisations should be accessed to help those groups to help themselves. We might also learn something from their catering. Pesticide use in Europe is under a spotlight, and it's an important part of the debate around sustainable food production. There's no consensus on what sustainable pesticide use actually looks like, but most people agree that increasing use and sustainable use are not the same thing. Unfortunately, whichever metric we look at, then we are actually increasing pesticide use. Optimum pesticide use at a landscape level is a difficult thing to define. A study of almost 1,000 farms in France set out to assess just that and concluded that most farms could have significantly reduced pesticide use without impairing productivity. So a study that large is inevitably open to criticism, but I believe those conclusions can be applied to the UK. We need to grasp the nettle of pesticide reduction. Few countries have been engaged in actively reducing pesticide use. Denmark and France are two which have gone down that route, and we should learn from their experience before we try to tread the same path. Olivia here belongs to a group called the DEFI Network in France. This is a group of farmers who are trying to reduce their reliance on pesticides. The government supports the DEFI Network in the hope that it will help it to reach its objectives of a 50% reduction in pesticide use by 2025. Now, Olivia wants to reduce his reliance on pesticide where he can, but he's got no ownership of that target. He doesn't even believe it's possible. He doesn't think we'll get partway there, but partly because nobody asked him what he thought about it. Now, one of the French government's policies associated with this target is to break the link between pesticide sales and advice. From the end of next year, then Olivia's local co-op will have to decide if it's to sell pesticides or to offer advice, because by then it'll be illegal to do both. It seems clear that they'll choose to continue to supply pesticides because that's their business model, and they're not keen on taking the risk of setting up a new consultancy business. There is no independent, viable agronomy sector in Olivia's area, and no thought seems to have been given as to how to fill the gap that would be left by his local sales rep agronomist. It's going to be an interesting case study. And there's a suggestion of introducing a version of this to the UK. It appears to address the potential distortion of agronomy advice through the incentives of a sales agronomist. But it ignores all of the other nudges to decision-making, which encourages agronomists, both independent and trade, to use more pesticides than are necessary. There's some people like to compare agronomy to medicine, with agronomists as crop doctors and pesticides as drugs. And it brings to mind the situation of antibiotic use. Nobody questions that doctors are doing the best by their patients, but they too are subject to nudges to their decision-making, and have been relying too heavily on the prescription of antibiotics, which are losing efficacy through overuse. You can see the similarities. Antibiotics and pesticides have some similarities in the way that they're used in agriculture. They're both synthetic products which can improve productivity but have external costs. RUMA, the Group for the Responsible Use of Medicines in Agriculture, has coordinated significant voluntary and self-reported reductions in antibiotic use, and it's resulted in much praise from all directions. The agronomy sector should look, learn, and copy that model and introduce the same principles. I recommend that the pesticides sector's voluntary initiative should be evolved into the responsible use of pesticides in agriculture, and RUPA should copy that RUMA model, get each sector to commit to pesticide reduction targets. These should be based on simple metrics of use and apply to 3-year rolling averages. When was the last time that we saw this kind of positive story around pesticides? Denmark's an old hand at managing pesticides at a landscape scale. Over the last 35 years, the important role that farming plays for the Danish economy has been balanced against the political drive to reduce pesticide use. And after an initial period of failure, using the same top-down targets as have been started in France, then Soren here has led an evolution of the way that we measure and control pesticide use in Denmark. He represents a wide range of interests, and although the equation that he's covering my face in a dodgy selfie is in Danish, you can see the complexity that is involved in taking into account all of those factors, including toxicity, environmental fate, and operator exposure. But to wait for the kind of agreement that we would need in this industry, in the UK, to adopt this pesticide load index would be kicking the can down a very long road. And when I raise this with people in the industry, I'm often told it isn't the right time. We must provide a united front against NGOs who campaign against pesticide use. But I disagree. We need to renew our social license to continue using pesticides in the way we do. And the time to act is now, while it's still within our control. So 3 very short conclusions. We need to create a new concept of financially accountable agronomy, use your power as consumers to demand it where it will work for you, get behind group working initiatives and develop the expertise and capacity needed to facilitate these groups, and accept that we need to reduce pesticides and turn the voluntary initiative into the responsible use of pesticides in agriculture to coordinate those reductions. There will be long-term benefits. Thank you.